Lesson 10, part 2 of our trilogy. We're calling this one In Judea, John 3:16 through John 4, verse 4. Acts 17:11 reminds us to trust but verify. Receive the word with all eagerness of mind, but examine the scriptures daily to see if these things were so. So let's us all be Bereans. Now we always want to have God go before us. So God, we praise you for your intricately designed word, which teaches us as disciples how to follow you. Now guard our minds and our hearts and draw us closer to you as we study. And let us study that we may become doers of your word and not just hearers only. Give us that Acts 17:11 discernment to test all things. We ask all of this in the name of Jesus, Yeshua, our Messiah. Amen. Our lesson 10 topics, we're continuing our trilogy in Jerusalem, in Judea, and in Samaria, and that comes from Acts 1:8. You will receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, in all Judea and Samaria, and to the end of the earth. And so that model, that formula that Jesus gives the disciples right before his ascension in Acts, he lays the groundwork for in right here in John, really chapters 2, 3, and 4. So last time we looked at in Jerusalem from chapter 2, verse 13 to 3:15. And in this lesson, we're going to continue that dialogue with Nicodemus, 3:16 through 21. And then we'll be in Judea, and it says he heads out to the wilderness with his disciples. He has a dialogue with John's disciples in 3:22 through 3:36. And then the beginning of chapter 4 says he must go through Samaria, and we'll look at what is going on there a little bit. And then next lesson will be in Samaria for the woman at the well. We're really going to build on the last half of the last lesson. After I recorded that video, we decided to split that into two. So this will be a little bit of the same if you watch that video, but we may expand on some things a little bit. So whether these are Jesus' words or John's words through the Holy Spirit, we're continuing this dialogue with Nicodemus that took place in Jerusalem. What we don't want to do is view John 3:16 through 21 as a separate thought. I've seen that written in some commentaries. Very much this is a continuation of Jesus' statement that just as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so shall the Son of Man be lifted up. And this is a very important dialogue in addition to being the most succinct verse on salvation that we have anywhere in the New Testament. It's a critical dialogue explaining why Jesus has to be lifted up. And then starting in verse 22, we're told that the disciples are in Judea, and they list a couple of towns, Anon near Salim. Now, they think that they've identified these towns up near Beth Shean. The interesting part about that is we're actually closer to Samaria up here than we are in Judea. But in any case, they left Jerusalem and headed out to the country. And then John chapter 4 gives us the curious geographic clue that Jesus had to return to Galilee through Samaria. Very interesting, because usually Jews would avoid Samaritans, and what they would do is they would leave Jerusalem, follow the trail down to Jericho, and then head up the Jordan River. Or if they were coming to Jerusalem, they would travel down the Jordan River and then head up through Jericho. Jesus doesn't do that this time. He's going to head due north along the famous Way of the Patriarchs, which is the same road Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob traveled when they needed to go north and south. So leaving Jerusalem, you're basically heading north through the hills up towards Shechem, and that's the route Jesus is going to take to Samaria and the famous meeting with the woman at the well. Last lesson in our live teaching, we left off at verse 15, and I'll just to reset the stage. Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up, that whoever believes in him may have eternal life. So Jesus is still answering Nicodemus' earlier question, how can these things be? And he draws that comparison to the book of Numbers where Moses lifted up the serpent. Now, remember, we see this as Jesus' death, but Nicodemus could not have foreseen that. Jesus was still alive when he was saying this, and he had no, possible premonition. Nicodemus didn't anyway, that the Son of Man must die. So this is lifted up in a multifaceted sense. So lifted up to be the Messiah, as well as lifted up in his death. For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have eternal life. That very famous verse. We'll pick up some more on the next slide as we look at our memory verse, But for one, here's the world. So God is loving the world. And it's interesting that while Matthew presents Jesus as coming for the lost sheep of Israel, John emphasizes that Jesus has come for the world. So he's come to Jews and Gentiles alike. He gave his only son. That is a reference to Genesis 22, where Abraham nearly offered Isaac, and Isaac is called Abraham's only son. And what the specific meaning there is your unique son, very special son, just as Jesus is a very special son of the Father. So Son of God expresses the true nature of Jesus' eternal and essential being. So he is the Logos made flesh, the Son emanated forth from God, and that's a quote from Lancaster's commentary. I would say that we're going to look a little bit at John 3:16, but one of the reasons it's so famous is because it is so simple and direct to understand. It really doesn't need a whole lot of insight or commentary to unpack, and that's what makes that verse so powerful. Our memory verse here is probably one that a lot of us already have memorized, John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave his only son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have eternal or everlasting life. Some thoughts from David Stern on this verse. God loves his creation so much that he gave that which is most precious to him, and that is his unique son, Jesus. Jesus is God's unique son. It's interesting, he is fully aware that he would have to die. He would have to be given. And so that is something that not everyone around him understood, but Jesus certainly understood it. And in fact, we'll see in several weeks when we get to Caesarea Philippi in our study that Peter, he tries to explain that to his disciples, and Peter rebukes him. So Peter can't accept it, and Jesus has to have a little discussion with him. And it's a lesson for all of us, not to get in front of God, because we're all like Peter in a lot of ways. Now we also have this laying down the line here, the line in the sand. Eternal suffering is punishment not only for the inevitable consequence of sin, but now, since God has given his son, if you reject that gift, that provision, then perishing is your lot. But the good news is, for the individual who trusts in Jesus, we have eternal life, and that means not only life beyond the grave, but a positive and more abundant life now in this world. And so that's exciting to think about. And those are notes from David Stern. Remember, the Jewish concept of verbs is always tied to action. So we see a word like believes, and we just tend to limit it to an intellectual acknowledgement, like I believe, my team won the game last night. But really what we're looking at for is a life where your deeds and your words are aligned. So a life that reflects a fundamental trust in and reliance on Jesus. That's the thought here. It's not just checking a box saying, yes, I believe, but are you living for him? John will actually make that pretty clear in the upcoming verses, so we'll want to keep that in mind. And then continuing to unpack verse 16, for God did not send his son into the world to condemn the world, but in order that the world might be saved through him. Whoever believes in him is not condemned, but whoever does not believe in him is condemned already, because he has not believed in the name of the only Son of God. And so that's interesting. You have this contrast with John 2:23, where it says many believed in his name. So there's a connection there. There's some debate in the commentaries about whether the passage from verse 16 through verse 21 is still Jesus speaking to Nicodemus, or whether that conversation ends at verse 15 and then 16 to 21 picks up John's commentary. Many of the Bibles, you'll see the words are in red, which according to the compilers of that version, they would see that as Jesus's words. Supporters of the John view would note a similarity between this passage and so verse 18, whoever does not believe is condemned already. That sounds a lot like something that John said in chapter 1. It's kind of this double meaning, double talk kind of language that John is famous for. Either way, these words are powerful and for the most part self-explanatory. What he's saying here is the first coming is not to bring judgment. Judgment will be handled in the second coming. And if you want more information on that, you can read the book of Revelation. It talks all about his second coming and then the judgment that is associated with it. Remember that thought that he did not come to condemn when we get to the scene at the synagogue at Nazareth in a couple of lessons. Jesus is going to read from Isaiah 61, but he's going to omit a line in Isaiah that turns out to be very telling in differentiating his first coming and his second coming. So remember that his first coming, Jesus is not here to condemn the world. We have several idioms for this eternal punishment. It's often described as eternal fire, so that brings up this burning the thorn, separating the wheat from the chaff, and then burning the chaff. John, or Jesus, whoever's writing here, is continuing to contrast light versus dark, innocent versus guilty, saved versus condemned, righteous versus wicked, all of these themes that we've been seeing so far in the Gospel of John. The Dead Sea Scrolls will also make these contrasts, so there's some parallels between the way John wrote and then the Dead Sea Scrolls. Verse 19 is worth unpacking a little bit. This is the judgment, that light has come into the world, but people loved the darkness rather than the light because their works were evil. I'll come back to that word loved on the next slide. So Jesus is now compared to a light coming into the world, which certainly recalls Genesis 1 and also John 1. So Genesis 1, verses 3 and 4, God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness, just as John is doing in his gospel here. And then back in chapter 1, verse 5, "The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it." Here's a picture of Jerusalem at night, and of course, in Jesus' day, the city would not have been quite this lit up after dark. A Greek lesson here, which I find fascinating, we often hear that the Greek word agape means God's perfect love. Now, as a noun, that may be true, but as a verb, it doesn't necessarily mean that, because, an example right here, verse 19 reads that men agapeo the darkness because their deeds were evil. So it's better to think of agape as something that we're totally or completely given over to, and that's an application question. Are we totally and completely given over to God, or do we just give part to God but save part for the world? And unfortunately, most days I'm in the latter category, but we strive not to love darkness. We strive to love the light. Note the design here of John, the way John is weaving all this together. So the passage begins with a dark heart, the lies of man. So we're back at the end of chapter 2. The meeting with Nicodemus takes place in the literal darkness. And now here this passage is ending with the truth and the light of God as contrasted against the darkness. As a literary form, this type of bracketing is very common. John's point is that the believer passes from death to life in moving from darkness to the light. Now, it's easy to look at verse 19 and conclude that this is only referring to unbelievers who reject God. And of course it is. But what we forget is that you and I at one point were in the darkness. Our sin nature at one point was ruling over us so that we love the darkness rather than the light. And even after coming to faith in Jesus, our sin nature still wants us to agapeo the darkness rather than light. And it's just something that we have to overcome. And of course, Paul writes about this quite a bit when he talks about the flesh versus the spirit. And so if someone agapeos the darkness, the last thing they want is to have their deeds exposed. And John's going to say exactly this. Verse 20, "For everyone who does wicked things hates the light and does not come to the light, lest his work should be exposed. But whoever does what is true comes to the light so that it may be clearly seen that his works have been carried out in God." So for disciples who believe in the Son, back in verse 16, that faith results in the believer moving from the darkness into the light. And such a belief is manifested in good deeds. Thus, the believer is unafraid to have the light expose the good deeds or the righteous works. We'll see a tie-in when we get to verse 36 at the end of this chapter. It reiterates this thought of obedience. And it says, "Whoever believes in the Son has eternal life. Whoever does not obey the Son shall not see life." So there's this concept that belief and obedience are very much connected. True Talmudim believe in him, walk with him, follow him, and then we also obey him. Lancaster writes, "Belief in him needs to result in repentance and turning towards God." So there's got to be some action to follow up our decision to follow Jesus. So just as a wrap up on Nicodemus came with questions, and perhaps he initially left with even more questions, but God rewards those that diligently seek after him. And so Nicodemus, from John 7 and John 19, we know that he is a believer. Despite his wealth and his status, his interview changed his life forever. And Nicodemus is one person I'm very much looking forward to meeting and talking with in the age to come, just to say, how did you make that transition? What was it like being in his position and yet yet being a believer and having to kind of work that political game that he had to do. After this, Jesus and his disciples went into the Judean countryside, and he remained there with them and was baptizing. John was also baptizing at Aenon near Salim, because the water was plentiful there, and people were coming and being baptized, for John had not yet been put in prison. Now a discussion arose between some of John's disciples and a single Judaioi, over purification. Here's a picture of where this region, where this meeting might have taken place. Note, though, the themes of purification, living water, and spirit, they run all through the early chapters of John. So we have chapter 1, the waters of baptism, chapter 2, the wedding at Cana, the stone jars of purification, and then later we have the cleansing and purifying of the temple, maybe why John put that episode at the end of chapter 2. Chapter 3, the discussion being born of water and spirit, and then now this discussion with verse 22. Chapter 4, the woman at the well, the discussion of living water. Chapter 5, we're going to see this man who's at the pools of Bethesda, and what those are, we believe, is a false healing center. So we've got these false waters versus the true Jesus who can bring true restoration and purification. And there are also references to purification by water in chapter 7, 9, 13, and 19. So it really is a theme that will run all throughout John's gospel. John is pointing out here that Jesus is the ceremonially pure one. Again, in contrast to the general world at large, and then particularly the defiled temple establishment. And they came to John and said to him, Rabbi, he who was with you across the Jordan, to whom you bore witness, look, he is baptizing, and all are going to him. And this is a picture of the probable location of Jesus' baptism outside of Jericho. John answered, a person cannot receive even one thing unless it is given him from heaven. You yourself bear me witness that I said, I am not the Christ, but I have been sent before him. The one who has the bride is the bridegroom. The friend of the bridegroom, who stands and hears him, rejoices greatly at the bridegroom's voice. Therefore, this joy of mine is now complete. He must increase, but I must decrease. And we looked at this earlier when we saw the disciples, two of them. John is pointing to Jesus, saying, there is the Son of God. Here he's describing his role in the form of a parable. So he's got the bride would be Israel, and the groom would be Messiah. So that's who's getting married here. The friend of the groom would be John. Bringing the bride to the groom would be John's ministry of immersion and repentance, and all of this about the Jewish wedding that we looked at previously. The voice here would be Jesus' call, or Jesus going public with his ministry. And so basically what John is saying, that my role is only to prepare Israel for her Messiah, and then my role is to step aside. John did not want his works to overshadow Jesus. So while possibly John's and Jesus' disciples here were trying to get a rivalry going here, John is not at all interested in this type of dispute. So John is not only not upset, he is joyful, right? Weddings are supposed to be joyful, and so John has the absolute right attitude here. Verse 30, though, is an important one for us as Talmudim. It is not about us. He must increase, but I must decrease. And if we're ambassadors for Jesus, we have to put his interests first and ours second. So that leads to our walking in the dust, almost a carbon copy of lesson 8, where Talmudim keep our eyes on God's bigger picture. So we see for a second time John's humility. The first was when he allowed two of his disciples to switch teachers. Again, imagine a teacher saying, well, go to that person because you're going to get a better education. The more we can keep our own pride and ego in check, the more the light of Jesus can shine through us. And for me, the ultimate goal is when people look at me, they don't see me, they see Jesus through me. And I think the times that actually happens, or maybe not as often as I would like, but it is something I'm striving for, to be less of me and more of him. Ephesians 4, I therefore, a prisoner for the Lord, urge you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling with which you have been called, with all humility and gentleness, patience, bearing with one another in love, eager to maintain the unity of the Spirit and the bond of peace. So less pride, more humility. John is now going to move into a discourse comparing the earthly man versus the heavenly man. He who comes from above is above all. He who is of the earth belongs to the earth and speaks in an earthly way. He who comes from heaven is above all. He bears witness to what he has seen and heard, yet no one receives his testimony. And this comparison reminds me of Paul. He framed this in terms of the first Adam versus the last Adam, and you can read that in 1 Corinthians 15. The first man was from the earth, a man of dust. The second man is from heaven. As was the man of dust, so are those who are of the dust. As is also the man of heaven, so are those who are from heaven. Just as we have borne the image of the man of dust, we shall also bear the image of the man in heaven. So this dual nature, we're of the earth, but yet when we come to faith, we are spiritual and heavenly. So again, you just can't escape these recurring themes of witness and testimony and so forth, and we'll see some more in the next couple verses. On the right is one of the Dead Sea Scrolls called the Testimonia, and it's not from the Bible, but it does contain some biblical verses that focus on the coming of the Messiah. And again, they're testifying to the fact that they thought the Messiah was near, and they were right. Cave 4 is that picture on the left, and it's that famous cave where many of the books of the Old Testament were found, including a complete copy of Isaiah. And this is the one you can see from beneath, and you see a lot of pictures of this cave here. This is another instance where John seemingly breaks off from quoting someone and then adds his own commentary. This passage is a little clearer than the transition from verse 15 to verse 16, whereas verse 16 is clearly a continuation of a discussion with Nicodemus, and whether it's John's words or Jesus' words, ultimately it doesn't matter that much because the words themselves are so powerful. Here it is clear John is transitioning from John the Baptist to John, the gospel writer's own words. He's picking up on that mystical discourse that he started back in chapter 1 of the pre-existent one. And as we've talked about before, John's gospel is focused with establishing, or I might say giving witness to who Jesus is, whereas the synoptic gospels focus on what Jesus said, did, and felt in that order. So if the synoptic gospels say something like the kingdom of heaven is at hand, John is going to say light has come into the world, because in John's view, light is who Jesus is. So John is focused on describing who Jesus is and then providing a testimony and affidavit to those truths. Verse 34, whoever receives his testimony sets his seal to this, that God is true. For he whom God has sent utters the words of God, for he gives spirit without measure. That's key. The Father loves the Son and has given all things into his hand. Whoever believes in the Son has eternal life. Whoever does not obey the Son shall not see life, but the wrath of God remains on him. So in that verse 36, you can see that John isn't really making a distinction between believing and obeying. If you believe, you're going to obey. If you don't believe, you're not going to obey. So there's the thought of just believing and then going on and living your life as if nothing mattered, nothing changes, was not something that John had a vision for. So back to the verse 34. So the seal, like again, an authentication, or in this type of document, a notary's stamp, authenticating the passage of the testimony. We tend to take a passage like the Spirit without measure for granted, but it was not that simple of a topic in Jesus' day. Back in Psalms 51, David could pray after his sin with Bathsheba and his confession. He could pray, "Take not your spirit from me," because in that case, the Spirit kind of came and went. Only the righteous would merit the Spirit, and in a grand sense, that's still true today. But if we have been sealed by the Spirit, as described by the Gospels and the other epistles, we actually cannot pray that prayer that David prayed, and nor would it ever occur to us to do so. And that's, again, that fundamental change that one of the many that Jesus brought. And again, as I mentioned, the concept of authorization present in John's Gospel, the Son is the fully authorized representative of the Father. So that's what John is stressing here. And then by saying the Father has given all things, that reminds us of those references. John 10, my Father who has given them to me is greater than all. No one is able to snatch them out of his Father's hand. And then Matthew 28 at the Great Commission, Jesus starts that with, Jesus came and said, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me, and then he passes it on to his disciples, and that's kind of neat for one of his disciples. And then the wrath talks about, Paul talks about that in Romans 1, verses 18 all the way through to chapter 8. I'll let you read that on your own. This is a case where I would have put the chapter break between verses 4 and 5 and really had this passage as part of the end of chapter 3. Now, when Jesus learned the Pharisees had heard that Jesus was making and baptizing more disciples than John, although not Jesus himself, but only his disciples. He left Judea and departed again for Galilee, and he had to pass through Samaria. So really a summation of chapter 3 here. John is establishing Jesus as the Father's authenticated representative, the Son who came. It was a gift from God because God so loved the world, and he gives the Spirit without measure. Now the Son is going to go up into Samaria to widen the people's narrow view of who the world is and who is eligible to believe in the Son and who is eligible to receive the Spirit. And then we'll see that with the woman at the well. I love this phrase that he had to pass through Samaria. So is Jesus compelled to do anything? He is here. He probably self-imposes this restriction rather than someone telling him he had to do this, but he has to go through Samaria. There's a divine appointment with the woman at the well. So Jesus' popularity here was growing. He's not ready to go full public with his ministry, so he makes a strategic retreat back to Galilee just to, let things simmer down a little bit. This is one reason I would tend to see the overturning of the tables that we read about in chapter 2 as occurring, the same event that occurred at the end of Jesus' ministry. I could be wrong about that, but here we see Jesus is trying to retreat a little bit, and so I find it odd that he would have made a spectacle in Jerusalem, not really caring who he angered, but then here he doesn't want a confrontation. Now, I could be wrong, but it's just something that I see. Also worth mentioning again that when John says Pharisees, we need to remember that John uses that term very loosely, and he includes Herodians, Sadducees, as well as the official party of the Pharisees. So in other words, he uses the word Pharisees to describe the entire religious establishment, even though Pharisees and Sadducees and Herodians didn't necessarily get along. Lancaster writes, we need to look closely at the context to decide whether we have Pharisees or Sadducees in view. There is a big difference, and indeed there is. It'd be like someone today saying, referring to a group as the politicians, and we need to figure out whether they're liberal, conservative, corrupt, clean. We just don't know from just the word. We need to dig a little bit. Now, in this case, the Pharisees were all about having disciples and followers. They were all about the purity of the law, and so I don't think that they would have had any problem with what Jesus was doing up to this point. Jesus hadn't done anything to arouse their suspicion, and if the overturning of the tables happened early in his ministry, the Pharisees probably would have applauded because they were not fans of the Sadducees and the corrupt temple. So again, just be very cautious with the term Pharisees. And then as we mentioned in the opening, after these things, Jesus traveled north from Jerusalem on that historic road of the patriarchs that ran along the ridge of the Ephraim hill country. You can see a picture there on the left. Very, very nice rolling hill country. Possibly Jesus passed by here on his way to the mandatory meeting with the woman at the well. And we will look at that in the next lesson. So we'll see you next time for the rest of John chapter 4. We hope you've enjoyed this lesson. For more information, find us on the web, www.talmudimway.org.